The Death Head Stamp. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the last straw. Parliament had passed a new tax. Now, every piece of paper that changed hands in the colonies, every newspaper, marriage license, will, diploma, and land deed had to carry a British stamp before it would be considered legal. And the colonists had to pay for the stamps. People were furious. Riots broke out in Boston. In other cities, there were demonstrations and violent speeches against the British. To many, the Stamp Act seemed like the death of liberty. Americans didn't mind paying taxes to their local governments. That seemed fair because they elected their own representatives, but there was nobody to represent them in the British Parliament. The Stamp Act was taxation without representation. It could not be allowed. Groups of angry men formed bands called the Sons of Liberty. They burst into the homes of stamp tax collectors and warned them to resign. If a stamp tax collector refused, the Sons of Liberty threw rocks through his precious windows. Glass was very expensive. If he still held out, they smashed his house and all his belongings. Naturally, hardly any stamps were sold. Parliament finally gave in and repealed the Stamp Act. What wonderful news. Bells rang out in every city. People danced in the streets. They cheered and drank toasts to good King George. Long live the king! They were sure that the king was on their side. Now they thought America would be treated fairly at last. Think about that. Let's look at some of these pictures. And this is what some of the stamps looked like. If a stamp tax collector refused to resign, he was sometimes chased out of town by a mob carrying clubs and throwing stones. Look at that stamp collector over there. The colonists drew stamps with a skull and crossbones. This was to show their belief that the Stamp Act was the death of liberty. Who were the Sons of Liberty? They were groups of men opposed to Britain's treatment of the colonies. Some were poor, uneducated workers. Others were wealthy merchants, lawyers, and teachers. Not all of them believed in mob violence, but the threat of it scared their opponents. Here's a guy. Look at this. Ebenezer Macintosh, a shoemaker, led a gang that joined the Sons of Liberty. They tore down the houses of stamp tax collectors and other British officials. They were always ready for a fight. Macintosh ran among his men, shouting orders through his speaking trumpet. Looks like a megaphone there. Whoa, look at this. This looks scary. One night, an effigy of Andrew Oliver, who had been appointed a stamp tax collector for Massachusetts, was hung from the Liberty Tree. An effigy of a boot with the devil crawling out of it was also hung from the tree. The boot stood for Lord Bute, a British politician whom the colonists hated. They considered him responsible for the Stamp Act. Okay, so that's not a real person. That's an effigy. An effigy is like a symbol, but that would still be scary if that was hanging outside your house, don't you think? And look, here they are, breaking the windows and smashing all the stuff that belonged to the stamp tax collector. So it looks like the rebels here are also causing some trouble. What would you think about them if you were the British government or a British citizen who lived in England? Look at this one. John Hancock was said to be the richest man in Boston. He was also a loyal son of liberty. Even before the Revolutionary War broke out, the British put him on their most wanted list. Look what they're doing to this man here. One young man spoke sneeringly of the colonies at a quilting party. The girls grabbed him, stripped off his shirt, poured molasses over his head, and feathered him with the tips of cattail plants. So here is a form of tarring and feathering. But this is the actual tarring and feathering that they discuss in the book over here, I think. They talk about it here. They don't. Well, I guess that comes up next. You'll see about that one next.